We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the centre of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 28th of April 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
Orate fratres, ut meum ac vestrum sacrificium acceptabile fiat apud Deum Patrem omnipotentem.
The funeral of His Holiness the Pope took place on Saturday. We'll hear about the atmosphere, the significance of the service, and what happens next for the Vatican and the Catholic Church. Also coming up, after the assassination of a Russian general and fresh US-Russia talks, we look at whether a Ukraine ceasefire is finally within reach and at what price. We'll have a roundup of the front pages, and then Monocle's fashion director will tell us how customers may be reassessing the value of luxury. Plus, after Venezuela held crucial local votes yesterday, we analyse the implications for Maduro's grip on power and the divided opposition's chances. Then...
we haven't built an industrial sector to cope with the increase in population, which forces us to be overly dependent on the rest of the world.
We'll look ahead to the urban issues at stake in Canada's upcoming election. And finally, we'll have a roundup of news from Greece, including the row surrounding a woman who's filed for divorce on the basis of a coffee reading by artificial intelligence. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Israeli jets bombed the southern edges of Beirut on Sunday after ordering the evacuation of what they say was an Hezbollah-linked building. Fires are still burning at Iran's biggest shipping hub after a massive explosion killed at least 40 people. And a 30-year-old man has been charged after allegedly mowing down a crowd at a Vancouver festival, killing 11 and injuring dozens. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, all weekend, journalist, broadcaster, former Vatican correspondent and regular Monocle contributor Juliet Linley has been in Rome for us, covering the funeral of Pope Francis. She's now back in our Zurich studio and joins us to look back at this historic and moving event as tens of thousands gathered alongside world leaders for an occasion that departed from traditional papal protocol. Juliet, many thanks for all your hard work over the weekend and for joining us this morning. I wonder if you could describe the mood in Rome over the last couple of days. What was the feeling on the ground?
Georgina, 20 years after covering the last papal funeral, my first papal funeral in 2005, this again felt like I was really witnessing Catholic history being made. You know, the mood was somber, but it was sunny. The skies above St. Peter's were the signature crisp, bright blue, if you want. And as I stood amidst the crowds, I was struck by how different the people around me were, despite all being there in this special place at this special time. You know, there were nuns from Eastern Europe, teenagers from northern Italy, tourists from Nottingham that I had talked to, and even like pilgrims from southern Italy. They were all there and united by a love for this Argentinian Pope, whom they all told me really spoke to their hearts. Of course, security was tight. There were metal detectors, there were bag checks, they were taking away everyone's water bottles. You could hear helicopters hovering throughout the ceremony. There were police zipping along in their rubber boats on the Tiber right below St. Peter's, and snipers and anti anti-drone measures were in place. But, everyone was calm. Everything felt that it was going smoothly. There were no underlying tensions that I could see. And I was there in the main road that leads to St. Peter's. It's called Via della Conciliazione. And we were all watching the funeral in the square play out on these big screens. We weren't close enough to actually see what was happening in the square, and there were such throngs of people. But, in so many ways, this ceremony was so momentous, not least by its numbers. I mean, 250,000 mourners around St. Peter's, 150,000 then lining the streets when Francis's casket was transferred from St. Peter's Basilica to the other key basilica of Rome, Santa Maria Maggiore. And then, of course, there were 130 delegations, 80 heads of state, government and monarchs. And don't forget all the millions watching this event play out live throughout the world on their TV screens. But yeah,
how different was it from your last experience in 2005?
Well, there were so many differences, but perhaps the most salient one was the fact that Pope Francis invited the poor, the marginalized, to take part in this ceremony, along with the royals and the monarchs and the heads of state and Zelensky and Trump, and also the fact that he didn't want to be buried behind Vatican walls. He wanted to be buried at his favorite basilica, where he went before and after every single one of his numerous international trips. He would go to St. Mary Major, pray to the Virgin Mary. And so it was such a striking image to see his coffin being transferred via Pope Mobile. That was so Francis, an open Pope Mobile, just driving through the 6 kilometer route from St. Peter's to St. Mary Major.
Now, you talked about the delegations that were there. Can you give us a sense of the key figures and how their presence shaped the day? I mean, certainly we've seen many, many reproductions of that Zelensky-Trump photograph.
Well, yes, just look at the front page yesterday of so many of the Italian dailies. And there was the epic photo of Zelensky and Trump sitting face to face amidst the majestic marble of St. Peter's Basilica. And whether you're religious, whether you're secular, the headline was Il Papa dei Miracoli, the Pope of Miracles. And it was kind of like, even after he is no longer with us, he's still he's still fighting for peace and creating some sort of a miracle, if you want. I mean, it's too early to say, of course, will that photo go down in history as a turning point in the war between Russia and Ukraine? But certainly it was momentous, and both sides expressed positivity afterwards, as you said. And those were that was sort of the moment that shaped the day. Other key figures were the ones that I mentioned before. You had so many of the world's who's who, whether from the royal world, whether from the political world, or of course, don't forget all the bishops, all the cardinals, all the clergy from different religious backgrounds, all there to pay homage to this Pope who fought so much for peace and for the poor. Now,
the Novem Diales period begins. What will this 9-day mourning process look like in Rome and at the Vatican?
So Novem Diales, the Latin term for this 9-day period of mourning following the death of any pontiff, it mainly involves daily masses, and different cardinals who have flown in from all over the world for this conclave will be saying the masses. You could, in a way, put it, Georgina, as the election campaign truly kicking off, because this is essentially the lead up to what will be the conclave, during which they will choose the successor to Pope Francis. Excuse me, and they have not yet decided what date will the conclave begin, but it is any time as of May 5th. And of course, there's a lot of politicking going on behind the scenes, as you might imagine, Georgina.
Who are seen as the main contenders, and what would they represent for the Church's direction?
If you want to look at the Church's direction right now, there are 3 ways that it could go. Either there's a complete swing to a conservative traditionalist, or you stick with the progressive ideals of Francis, or you go for a mainstream candidate who would be perhaps geopolitically and diplomatically capable. So if you want to just look very quickly at the top contenders, so the top conservative papal contender, a lot of people are saying would be Hungary's Cardinal Peter Erdo. He's a canon lawyer, he's a theologian, he would focus on doctrine, and he would probably decelerate significantly the progressive momentum that Francis has been taking over the years. As far as mainstream candidates, there are two strong ones. They both happen to be Italian. One is the Pope's number 2. He's Pietro Parolin. He's equivalent of, let's say, the Prime Minister of the Vatican. Well-respected, well-travelled, and as a matter of fact, he knows a lot of the cardinals because his job has taken him to so many far-reaching spots around the world, and it's important for the candidate to know the other people who might be voting for him. And the other contender in the mainstream section, if you want, would be Matteo Zuppi. He's the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, and he's got a lot of international experience as well, and he recently was involved in prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. And just quickly, if you want to look at a progressive also from what you might call the global south, he's Luis Antonio Tagle from the Philippines, and he would probably continue within Francis's, with focusing on the poor and emerging Catholic populations that are especially in Asia and in Africa, and he would be, again, another non-European pope, just as Pope Francis was.
And Juliet, finally, how do you think Pope Francis's legacy will shape the mood and the decisions made inside the conclave?
Well, for sure, his legacy is going to play a massive role in this conclave. I mean, the cardinals are aware of the juncture that the church is at. The divisions are pretty clear to see, and while a lot of them might not have agreed with him, there certainly was a lot of trust for him. But remember, given that 80% of cardinals were chosen by Francis himself, you would imagine his successor will broadly align with his direction. But Georgina, there is no Francis 2.0 candidate, and there could well be a swing in the opposite direction. And as always, conclaves are secret. They're highly unpredictable affairs. So until that white smoke comes out of the chimney at the Sistine Chapel, all we can do is predict, or try to predict, speculate and hypothesize.
Juliet, sorry, just before you go there, how do they ensure that the smoke is either white or black?
Such a good question. I think they have additives that they add. And this came up at the last conclave in 2005 because a lot of people were having trouble discerning, is it grey, is it white, is it black? And
is it just the cardinals vaping?
But then the decision was, we will toll the great bell of St. Peter's when a candidate is chosen. So then you really will know we do have a pope.
Juliet, thank you very much indeed. That's Juliet Linley there, who's been at the Vatican for us all weekend, now back in Zurich. It is 9:11 in Kyiv, 7:11 here in London. This weekend we saw two very different visions for Ukraine's future standing side by side at the funeral of Pope Francis, as we've just heard. Volodymyr Zelensky representing a country still fighting for every inch of its territory, and Donald Trump, who's pushing for a rapid peace deal with Russia that may involve painful concessions. Meanwhile, a Russian general has been assassinated in Moscow, US diplomats are locked in complex negotiations, and European powers are trying to push their own ceasefire plans. So what's the real likelihood of a deal, and at what cost? I'm joined now by Jenny Mathers, who's a senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University. Jenny, good to have you back with us. Seeing Zelensky and Trump in the same place this weekend was a really potent image. How much do their competing approaches to peace now define Ukraine's future? And where does Europe's rival ceasefire plan fit into this picture?
Well, that's the question. It was a very encouraging sign in many respects to see Trump and Zelensky sitting down face to face, speaking to each other directly. But we're going to have to see whether that conversation does prove to be, some kind of lasting impact, have some kind of lasting impact on the peace process. Trump's idea of peace is basically he wants something to happen quickly. He's very sympathetic towards Russia's position. And so his peace plan involves a lot of what Russia wants to get out of this war and almost nothing that Ukraine is hoping to achieve in terms of its short-term or long-term security. The Europeans, however, have come in with an alternative, which brings a lot more of Ukraine's concerns and interests to the forefront, although it still does admit, territorial concessions are likely to happen. But there's a more of a staging process here, and Russia needs to prove itself first through a general ceasefire and then through, a peace process before things like sanctions could be lifted. So they're very radically different sort of visions for the future.
And in fact, over the weekend, we heard the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, warning Ukraine not to take the US deal.
That's right. I mean, Ukraine is obviously in a very difficult position because it's got under a lot of pressure from the Trump administration. Zelensky clearly wants to try and keep the U.S. on side as much as he can to try and maintain that sort of both short-term and longer-term military and financial support. And nevertheless, though, the price of keeping Trump on side could be a very high one, and it might be one that both Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are not willing to pay.
So the Kremlin described the Witkoff-Putin talks on Friday as constructive. What do we know about those?
We haven't heard very much at all about those. We've heard a little bit from the Russian side, as you say, that they were constructive. They apparently lasted for 3 hours. They involved some of Putin's very sort of senior advisors who've been involved in these talks in the past. We saw lots of pictures of smiley handshakes at the beginning. We haven't heard anything from Witkoff as far as I'm aware. Apparently, Putin has sent Witkoff back to Washington with a message for Trump, but we don't know what that is yet. But certainly afterwards, we have heard from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, basically saying, well, the status of Crimea is not up for negotiation, really pushing a harder line. So whether or not Putin has really shifted on anything significant as a result of these talks on Friday, we just don't know.
I mean, Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, saying that Ukraine may have to cede land to end the war has really caused a stir. I mean, how does that idea resonate inside Ukraine? Would it even be constitutional?
Well, I think it might depend upon the precise nature of what that ceding is. If it's sort of a temporary de facto, well, for the time being, we're going to have to accept that Russia is in control of this territory. That might, be marginally acceptable. But if it's a permanent kind of a ceding, then no, I'm sure that would be very unacceptable to the majority of Ukrainians and also would probably contravene their constitution.
I mean, Trump's openly stating that Crimea will stay with Russia. So what red lines, if any, remain for Ukraine and its allies, and what compromises might Washington be willing to accept?
Well, I think for Ukraine, definitely a formal acceptance that any part of Ukrainian territory is now belonging to Russia. Any sort of legitimacy over Russia's illegal annexation and occupation of Ukrainian land is a red line. And so far, we've seen no sign that Zelensky is willing to back down on that. So that's important to remember. But we just don't know how much, if any, pressure the Trump administration might be willing to put on Russia, because Trump has expressed dissatisfaction with the continuation of Russian bombing of cities in Ukraine since the peace process, as it were, has begun. He's expressed, anger and has called upon Putin to stop, but obviously that hasn't happened. Whether any of that frustration translates into actual pressure on Russia rather than more and more concessions and carrots being held out, that's something that we obviously don't know. I mean, so far, we haven't seen Trump willing to put really any significant pressure on Russia at all. So I'm not optimistic that this historic meeting, in the Vatican between Trump and Zelensky is really going to be a fundamental turning point.
And yet there is a lot of pressure on building on Kyiv to agree to terms sooner rather than later, with many people saying, look, the result's going to be the same, but you could just have 3 more years of fighting before you get there.
Yes, and I think it's a hard one because, the Ukrainians are fighting against an invasion. The Russia is the illegal occupier. They're fighting for their existence, and Russia has made it clear that, it doesn't intend to stop with just these territories. Putin has made his long-term ambitions of controlling Ukraine very, very clear. And so, it is an existential struggle for the Ukrainians. It's a very difficult position that they're in.
So the assassination of Major General Moskalik near Moscow on Friday raises big questions. How is that being interpreted? What does it suggest about instability within Russia?
Well, it certainly suggests that the Ukrainian security services are doing, continue to do a good job behind the lines in Russia. They've been attacking all kinds of Russian military facilities and oil refineries and so on over the past months. They've assassinated a number of senior Russian officials, in the heart of Moscow. So it suggests that they have considerable reach and effectiveness. it also raises questions about, security in Russia itself, and how comfortable Moscow should feel about its degree of sort of openness to these kind of infiltrations. I mean, the Lieutenant General himself was quite senior in the general staff, so symbolically important, and also apparently was being lined up for other even more senior jobs. So a significant figure in and of himself. Surprisingly little has been talked about, in terms of the impact of this on wider kind of war efforts and so on. It's kind of been drowned out by all of the other things that have happened over the past several days with meetings and peace talks and so on. But we'll see how effective it turns out to be as far as the Ukrainians are concerned in reducing Russia's ability to wage the war.
Jenny, thank you very much indeed. That's Jenny Mathers there. Now, still to come on the programme.
Customers are reassessing the value of luxury, raising their standards, and only investing in best-in-class quality or designs that touch them emotionally.
This is The Globalist.
IQ, EQ, and AI. 3 components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence, all to elevate you. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me in the studio is Yasmin Abdel-Majid, who is a Sudanese-Australian broadcaster and author. Good morning to you, Yasmin.
Good morning.
Let's talk about how Trump is even impacting the Australian elections.
Yes, Trump's influence and impact seems to be quite far-reaching, but interestingly in the Australian context, maybe not what we might expect. So Australia's going to the polls this weekend on May the 3rd. And we've got a report from Reuters talking about how Trump chaos is actually making a Conservative vote risky. And what they're seeing, and what a few different places are reporting actually, that the impact of the tariff chaos, of the sort of what's broadly seen as confusion and uncertainty, is making people move further away from the Conservative vote, which is actually in opposition to what we might have seen a few weeks ago. So it's important to note here as well that the Labour Prime Minister Anthony Albanese delayed the election because of a cyclone a few weeks ago, some weeks ago now, in Brisbane. And because of that delay, it meant that the election has actually, the impact of the tariffs has actually come into fore while the election is going on. The election campaign, is going on. And also what has been an unexpected sort of outcome is Peter Dutton, who's the head of the sort of more Conservative party, has actually had to distance himself somewhat from Trump, which is quite unusual because the Conservatives tend to be very closely aligned with the United States. So especially in a time when, we're at the 100-day mark around about of the Trump presidency, and also for the first time, young people, millennials and Zoomers and Gen Z, will be a bigger voting bloc than baby boomers in Australia. It's quite interesting to see how this will play out.
And there's a great piece actually that you found, I think, in the Sydney Morning Herald, talking about those young people and giving us an idea of what they think about this whole process.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I remember those days when I was the young person who would give these sorts of opinions, but that's definitely not the case anymore. But it is interesting because, the cost of living crisis is something a lot of young people are talking about, but they sort of see this broad range. So it's, yes, they're frustrated about the cost of living, but they're also worried about an Americanization of Australian politics and landscape. They're worried about, will healthcare be something that sort of becomes Americanized? They're concerned about, the uncertainty around the job market more broadly. They also, and this particularly in Australia, quite a few references of, yes, they're talking about energy policy, but they're not talking about climate change and so on, which has been a huge flashpoint in the Australian context.
And that's really where the Teals come in. Just tell us a little bit about this grouping.
So last election, we saw the emergence of this group. So the Teals are considered sort of economically conservative, but socially or on the climate side of things more progressive. They are a group of people, mostly women, who sort of came up as independents and took a huge bloc actually away from the traditional Conservative or the Liberal Party in Australia, who are considered the Conservatives. And it will be interesting again to see if the Teals will be sustained as a bloc of people who, economically conservative but interested in climate change policies, interested in being forward in renewable energy and so on. Or there was always a question of, is this just a flash in the pan for the last election, or will this be something that continues? And so this will definitely be something worth paying attention to this election.
Now, earlier we were talking about Ukraine and whether they will be forced to concede territory. And one thing that this whole resolution is pointing to is that if Russia gets to hold on to Crimea or indeed any other bits, it will just embolden places like China, which of course has its eye on Taiwan. And actually they've made a little movement in that direction, seizing a tiny sandbank in the South China Sea. It actually belongs to the Philippines, I think.
Exactly. And so this was reported by the FT over the weekend and then ends now on the BBC. But Sandy Cay is this tiny, only a few 100-meter long bank, like sandbank in the South China Sea. But it is just kilometers away from the Philippines' main military outpost in Titu Island. Or there's a couple of, different, Philippines calls it one thing, China calls it something else and so on. But what's interesting about this is it sort of is happening around the same time that the Philippines and the US are conducting something called Balikatan, which is their sort of large annual military exercise. And so that includes coastal defense and island seizure drills and so on. And so this is currently happening on Philippine territory. So the timing of this, obviously, from China's perspective, is quite strategic. And this particular bank is part of something called the Spratlys, right? And the Spratlys are a collection of islands that are above some very sort of oil and gas wealthy territory. And again, if China can kind of make the claim, because it's not as if the soldiers arrived and have occupied. They sort of arrived, took a photo with the flag, and then left. Okay, so it was sort of more
it's a poke, isn't it?
Exactly.
They're trolling them.
It is the trolling, definitely. But if they can, make these sorts of claims around the territory, then you can kind of make a claim for what is underneath that particular bank. And so, again, it's interesting to see while everything is happening in the United States, observers have been glad, I must say. Some of the reporting has been saying that observers have been glad that with everything going on with Trump at the moment and, machinations with Russia and so on, at the very least, the US has continued these sorts of drills with Philippines and so on in the region. But it is interesting to see that despite given everything, that China is still trying to kind of make these moves, and the scuffling between the Philippines and China does continue.
Yeah, well, China, of course, not just operational within the South China Sea, but also online here in Britain. And there's a big piece about how an online campaign urged the far right here in this country to attack China's opponents in the UK.
Yeah, this was quite a fascinating piece because we are aware that there was a large group of Hong Kong activists and democracy protesters and agitators and so on who came from Hong Kong in the wake of the last couple of years and settled in the UK. They got asylum in the UK, and broadly the idea was that the UK would protect them. However, and this ties in with major incidents that happened in the UK last year. If listeners remember, in August last year in the UK, across the UK, there were riots, right, provoked by a sort of misinformation about an incident that happened in the north against asylum seekers, mostly against Muslims. But also, this report finds that this wave of racist and anti-asylum seeker rioters was used by allegedly by sort of online security agencies to agitate against specifically these Hong Kong activists. And so this particular Guardian piece looks at one activist in particular named Fin Lau, who found on a Facebook post or on some social media channels generally, including Telegram and so on, examples of people who sounded like far-right Britons sort of saying, we have to go after these Hong Kong, activists. They're here to take our resources and so on. And, their names were posted, their addresses were posted, their places they work were posted and so on. And so it looked like it was just, incitement, or it was just you're average sort of quote-unquote racist rioter, but actually these were accounts created allegedly by security agencies backed by China in order to incite violence.
And analysis of the language and so on has shown that that probably is the case. Now, that was reported in The Guardian. Huge media story this weekend of its sister paper, The Observer. It's the oldest Sunday newspaper in this country, but on this Sunday it really became the newest because it's been taken over.
It has been taken over by a small digital news startup called Tortoise, which listeners may or may not know about, set up primarily by somebody named James Harding, who used to be the editor of BBC News, also the editor at The Times. And it's been quite a controversial move, actually. And last year, as this was announced, the takeover of Tortoise, by the takeover over The Observer by Tortoise, there was major protest by The Guardian journalists, there was strikes and so on. But unfortunately, all of that movement, all of that activation hasn't seemed to change the actual outcome, which is The Observer is being taken over. Now, Tortoise will claim that, or Tortoise has claimed that, this was about injecting funding into the newspaper. They're sort of refreshing, and even, James Harding put out a letter over the weekend to sort of say we are continuing editorial independence, we're continuing the proud legacy of this paper. But of course, there's concern, I think, from many of the journalists that this isn't something that is, there's a question of how they will be able to hold their owners accountable.
And whether their owners will run out of money. I think that was one of the big fears, is that Tortoise can do this for a couple of years, but unless they turn that model around, that's the end.
Exactly. And that was something pointed to because it is still a startup. It is still sort of backed by funding. While there isn't anyone with a majority stake, it is still like any sort of VC-backed type of organization. It has a runway, and once that runway runs out, then you might be in a tough situation, and whether or not they'll be able to turn it around, it's a question that remains to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if listeners want to have a look at that, there is this letter from Harding in yesterday's Observer. Yasmin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's Yasmin Abdelmajid, who's a Sudanese-Australian broadcaster and author. And now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Israeli jets bombed the southern edges of Beirut on Sunday after ordering the evacuation of what they say was a Hezbollah-linked building. The assault shattered a 5-month ceasefire that had paused fighting between Israel and the Iranian-backed group. Outrage is boiling over in Iran after a massive explosion tore through its largest shipping hub, killing at least 40 people. Fires still burn at Shahid Raji port a day after the blast, as toxic smoke continues to choke nearby towns. And a 30-year-old man has been charged after allegedly mowing down a crowd at a Vancouver festival, killing 11 and injuring dozens. Prosecutors say the suspect, Kai J. Adam Lowe, faces 8 counts of second-degree murder so far, with more likely to follow. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now it's time for us to turn to one of the other stories across our radar. Today, Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Teodosi, explains that while opportunity still exists, customers are reassessing the value of luxury.
The luxury slowdown has been one of the fashion industry's biggest topics of conversation this year, dominating both headlines and post-runway chatter. Retailers are reassessing their budgets and renegotiating selling terms with brands, while luxury houses are downsizing their events. Some media types are wondering whether they will lose their Fashion Week chauffeurs next season. There is no questioning the slowdown. For the first quarter of 2025, LVMH, the world's largest luxury group, reported a 4% sales drop for its all-important fashion and leather goods division, while sales at Kering-owned Gucci dropped by 25%. Donald Trump's tariffs pose another very real threat, with brands needing to reconfigure their supply chains and potentially raise prices that are already inflated. This week, Louis Vuitton made the decision to increase the price of its popular Neverfull tote by 4.8% in the US. But the industry also has a tendency to overreact. Hermès has just reported a 9% revenue uptick, reaching more than 4 billion euros, while Brunello Cucinelli grew by 10.5%. The Prada Group has also turned Miu Miu into a billion-euro brand and expanded its portfolio, acquiring fellow Italian label Versace for 1.2 billion euros. Opportunity still exists, but with tougher market conditions, customers are reassessing the value of luxury, raising their standards, and only investing in best-in-class quality or designs that touch them emotionally. Some houses have been relying on branding and reissuing archival designs for a little too long, a band-aid strategy, as analysts like to call it, that is now catching up with them. When I think about the chasm between different brands' balance sheets, I keep returning to a conversation that I recently had with Amy Smilovich, a designer and Tipee's founder, who alighted on her own formula for success by downsizing her company, focusing on her own taste, and ignoring industry trends. You can't do luxury on 1 billion euros of sales, she told me. The success of the likes of Hermès and Miu Miu might contradict her statement. Still, it's becoming clear that achieving luxury at scale is a near impossible undertaking. It requires a delicate balance of creative risk-taking and smart financial forecasting that only the boldest, most visionary business leaders will be able to get right in the current landscape.
Monocle's fashion director Natalie Teodosi. And for more from Monocle's editors and correspondents around the world, do sign up for our free daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. Venezuela's second national popular consultation 2025 took place yesterday, serving as a significant test for President Nicolas Maduro's grip on power. Following his disputed 2024 re-election, these polls are seen as a critical indicator of his legitimacy. With opposition groups divided and international scrutiny intensifying, the outcome could have profound implications for Venezuela's political landscape. Well, I'm joined now by Oscar Guardiola Rivera, who's a professor of international law and international affairs at Birkbeck College. Oscar, these were not really elections in the way that we understand them. Can you explain what this popular consultation is?
You're right, Georgina. These are not your typical representative democracy elections. These elections were not about electing someone to represent your interest as a constituency in an assembly, but rather these were aimed at allocating money, budget, and in fact sort of building the budget from the ground up. The so-called communes, which are the protagonists of these elections, are typically formed by the coming together of several communal councils, each consisting of dozens of families in a neighborhood. So imagine your neighborhood coming together and selecting the kinds of projects that the national budget will thereafter fund. That's what happened yesterday. It is important because although different from what we are more used to, these are deepening a kind of grassroots democracy that could prove very important to Maduro, particularly given that the assembly, the parliamentary elections are going to happen in late May.
And do we have any sort of early indications of what was decided?
What we have are indications of important levels of participation. That would be crucial for Maduro. Although it has to be, we need to distinguish, because the communes, although they are now being embraced by the Chavista government, they were, they come from before. Not always they are aligned with the government. This is a more, as I said before, kind of grassroots democratic movement, and they tend to be quite autonomous. There are some in the Bolivar province, for instance, and in Zulia, which have proven to be autonomous and even critical of the government. So what we see now is a sort of contradictory collaboration, a symbiotic relationship. The government needs these communes in order to reassert some kind of legitimacy. And the communes are being pragmatic to a certain extent, but they're also driven by the longer history of grassroots democracy in Venezuela. It's quite an interesting experiment, on the one hand, because it's a form of empowerment of grassroots communities. On the other hand, what they receive in terms of funding is not much. There are close to 4,600 communes in Venezuela. Each one of them would receive between $10,000 to $20,000. Not much, but that allows them, for instance, to fix a road, to buy an ambulance. And that also will push the candidates for parliamentary elections in May to make more substantial promises.
And so just looking at that electoral landscape more generally, I wonder how significant the participation of opposition groups is, and what does it suggest about their strategy moving forward? How united are the opposition? Because some are pulling out, refusing to participate, some are banding together.
The opposition is not united. In fact, it's probably more divided now than it was before, which might be surprising to many. The far-right opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado and González, who has been accepted as or credited to have won the presidential elections, is boycotting these elections and the coming elections in late May. Whereas the other side of the opposition, led by Enrique Capriles and others, these are right-wing figures as well, are calling for strong participation in the elections. They are convinced that if it is the case, as many believe, that González won the presidential election, then that level of participation should become apparent in parliamentary elections. Having said that, there is less pressure also from the Trump administration of the United States, quite the opposite of what many thought would happen. And, interestingly enough, Maduro seems now stronger than he was at the end of last year.
Even given the economic challenges, we know that Venezuela, there's fluctuating oil prices, currencies going down and so on. Is that affecting voter sentiment?
Absolutely. The economic problems are there, and there is a mixture of anger and frustration among the Venezuelan electorate, which is complicated because when you feel frustrated, the tendency is not to go out and vote, and that's what seems to have happened. For instance, I would be very interested in seeing the numbers for this election. We don't have them, and we'll probably never have them. That would be a real indicator. But that frustration, coupled with the opposition's division, bodes well for Maduro. Also because there are other problems. Yes, there is the economy. But you now see these big numbers of Venezuelans imprisoned for no reason in El Salvador. And that gives Maduro an opportunity to keep playing the, we are being invaded, or we're trying to forestall a potential invasion, and our sovereignty is being undermined. And that bodes well with his followers.
Absolutely. You mentioned the US. What role then do international or even regional players have in the whole electoral environment?
They do have a role, and part of the problem that the far-right opposition is facing is that the support from the Trump administration does not seem as clear as it was. There is a division within the Trump administration in the U.S. between hardliners such as Marco Rubio, who are dead against the Maduro administration, but there seemed to be a wing or a side constituted by pragmatists who have left open channels for dialogue, and the latter seem to be carrying the day. Trump is not really, or does not seem to be really interested in the southern part of the hemisphere for any other reason than to boost his credentials as anti-immigration. but in a sense, that leaves someone like Maduro freer to act.
And you say Maduro is probably stronger. So what are the potential scenarios for Venezuela's political future, and what steps would be necessary for more stability?
Well, it depends, of course, what we understand by stability. In a sense, Maduro is playing his cards better than the opposition. The deepening of the power of the communes, which, as I said before, can be autonomous from the government, still helps the revolution, because most of the communes are or come from a left-leaning historical tradition. On the other hand, the division of the opposition does mean that it will be very, very difficult for them to oust Maduro.
Oscar, thank you very much indeed. Lovely to see you, as always. That was Oscar Guardiola Rivera. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
Each of us has a craft, a calling that inspires us. Whether it's how a coffee is brewed, a chair is built, or how money is looked after. There's a love for the work, a care that compels you forward. For us at UBS, it's about designing a unique outcome for you. Because whatever your craft may be, ours is built around helping you succeed. UBS, banking is our craft.
Well, let's stay on election watch here on The Globalist, because today Canadians are heading to the polls. With a national housing shortage and rising cost of living, there's a lot at stake in this election. Monocle's contributing editor Sheena Rossiter sent us this report to explain how federal politics and the economy are largely dictating the current urban landscape.
It's been an unavoidable part of daily life in Canada so far this year. Politics.
I've just requested that the Governor-General dissolve Parliament and call an election for April 28th.
Just 9 days after being sworn in as Prime Minister, Mark Carney stood at a wooden lectern that donned a chisel maple leaf on the steps of Rideau Hall, the official residence of the Governor-General of Canada. His call for a snap election is another move in what's been a turbulent 2025 in the world of Canadian politics.
We are facing the most significant crisis of our lifetimes because of President Trump's unjustified trade actions and his threats to our sovereignty. Our response must be to build a strong economy and a more secure Canada.
Carney is unelected. In recent history, the last time there was an unelected Prime Minister in Canada was John Turner in 1984. This snap election call is seen as a way to get more stability in Canadian politics, regardless of which party will hold power. Canada's Parliament has been prorogued since former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigned in early January, and with the cost of living and the current housing crisis being top issues on the ballot, Canadians across the country are eager for policies to be put into action.
We're going to get some dinner started here in a couple of minutes.
So how pressing is this issue for home and city builders?
We've got a pretty dynamic couple of speakers here who have traveled great and short distances to be with us tonight to talk about the future of the economy in our city in Alberta.
Both home and city builders sit down for a banquet dinner in downtown Edmonton. They're all gathered here to get the forecast of the economy and what that means for building desperately needed homes. Well before the start of the year, there has been a housing crisis in full effect. There is currently a shortfall of 3.1 million homes across the country. Nearly half of Canadians report being very concerned about housing affordability because of the rising cost of housing or rent. That's according to Statistics Canada. There are several factors that play into this crisis. A labor shortage is partly to blame, but the discrepancy of how many people would be living in Canada this year didn't help developers and planners when it came to planning cities. Stéphane Marion is the chief economist at the National Bank of Canada, and he explains more.
We've added 3 million Canadians in 3 years in the country. You normally do this over a span of 8 to 10 years, but we haven't built an industrial sector to cope with the increase in population, which forces us to be overly dependent on the rest of the world for some of the products that we need to consume in our country. And I think the manufacturing sector should offer hope that we can redefine our country in order not to jeopardize our economic sovereignty, which is under threat at this point in time. So it's a wake-up moment, I think, for policymakers.
Many newcomers arrived on Canadian soil, and life hasn't been what they imagined it to be. This has led to some new arrivals in the country to return back home. As Stéphane Marion explains, not all aspects of life were looked at when this immigration policy was created.
Well, we broke our social contract when we ran an immigration policy that was very aggressive without building the infrastructure that needed to come with it. So basically we're saying we're trying to poach foreign talent, which is very important for our future economic growth. But you can't find a family doctor, unable to find daycare, try to find a place in school. This is the issue where we brought the people but forgot to build the infrastructure. So by breaking this social contract, I think there will be an overhang. We will pay a price for that. How big a price, we'll see. But certainly some people are frustrated to see that you invited me to your country. I want to be productive, but I can't be productive because you don't even have those key infrastructure. The lifestyle is a whole package. So this is where there was some failure in the immigration policy.
And this population increase is a major pressure point for housing right now. Here's Paul Lanny, president and CEO of Averton, a real estate developer with operations in both Toronto and Edmonton.
The rise in population, the sheer number of houses that are in demand right now is really making this issue larger than it's ever been. We know in conversations with the province that they've made it a priority for the province of Alberta, recently stating that we are 100,000 homes short of what we need just right now, let alone the growth that continues to happen. Alberta, as an individual jurisdiction, has grown 4.4%, which is the largest in the world, the fastest growth in the world. So with that growth, we need housing. We have not built enough housing for the amount of people that have arrived in this province.
Densifying is key. Being able to adapt to higher density is just part of the maturation of a city, says Paul.
Because we have a fixed amount of labor, building less dense housing uses up that labor less efficiently. Put simply, if you're swinging a hammer building a single house or you're swinging a hammer building an 8-plex of row housing, for example, you're creating that much more housing. We're exploring different built forms that get us a greater yield per acre. That's all going to help because where traditionally we might have built one house, we might be able to build multiple. And I think that's going to create solutions for families, for new arrivals in the province and across the country.
For Paul Lanny, regardless of the election outcome here in Canada or tariffs being imposed by the United States, creating more homes for people to live in, be it newcomers or otherwise, has to remain a priority as Canadian cities continue to grow. Canada's housing crisis will need to be solved regardless of trade wars.
We have to keep building. That's the bigger issue we have to face right now. And there's an opportunity where the amount of households that have been formed over the last few years relative to the amount of housing stock being produced, there's a huge deficit there. We're only building 40,000 houses a year, but we're bringing in hundreds of thousands of people a year.
For Monocle Radio in Edmonton, I'm Sheena Rossiter.
Many thanks there to Sheena, and join us tomorrow as we bring you analysis on the results of today's Canadian vote. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally today, it's time to take a look at Greece and some of the stories making the headlines. I'm joined now in the studio by the normally Athens-based journalist Emmanuel Papavasiliou. Nailed it, Manos, yes. Did I?
Nice. Hi, Georgina. It's really nice to be back here in the Midori house.
We've missed you, so welcome.
I missed it.
Let's start off with this. I mean, Greece and Turkey have been at each other for centuries, haven't they? Really?
For centuries and more lately as well. And they've been trying to fix their relationships. But it always turns sour in one way or another. So now the latest is that basically Greece has completed its own marine spatial planning, an MSP as they called it. And what that is basically a thorough set of rules that allow the country to better regulate human activities in the sea. So these activities might be from fishing to shipping to renewable energy and environmental protection in a way that, it ensures the sustainable development of marine seas. And it's basically a plan of rules of what activities can happen within the country's maritime zones and how they can coexist with the environment. And it's all great because it balances economic development with ecological protection. It follows EU legislations and the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. All good for the environment, but basically it's also very important geopolitically for Greece because for the very first time it's a document that officiates EU-recognized document that legally defines the uttermost potential boundaries of Greece's continental self. And obviously, this has created a response from Turkey because it includes a lot of the areas in the Aegean Sea where Turkey also contests.
Turkey, of course, has its own expansionist blue homeland doctrine.
It does, and it's something that... It's not something new. They've been talking a lot about it in nationalistic circles, but now it has become part of the government's response, and it's basically an idea that part of Aegean islands that are currently Greek are belonging to Turkey, and as a response, Turkey has created its own MSP, its own map that takes inspiration from that and includes Aegean islands as their own. So, as we said, relations have soured, but Mitsotakis, the Greek Prime Minister, has told that basically he's not looking for another fight with Turkey. This is completely an economic thing for Greece. So there are now talks to organize high-level meetings between him and Erdogan soon in the future.
Now, a bit of a slump politically and also economically for the Greek government, particularly over Easter holidays, but they are now announcing a new wave of economic measures to kickstart a fresh political cycle.
Yeah, this is what happens locally. Basically, after a series of scandals recently, such as like the Tempe disaster and how the government responded to that in the public, or other scandals that involve members of the party being paid by local companies. The Prime Minister has been out and to unveil a new wave of economic measures in order to appease the people after the Easter and also to, highlight where the government is doing well, which is the economy. And it targets, pensioners, a lot of people with a lot of tax cuts. And it's a way to show, this is what we're doing. This is a way for us that we're winning. So, and it instantly, it tracked because it really, up their polling numbers.
Well, of course, that is something that can be based on policy. But what about telling the future through coffee grounds? This is the most extraordinary story. Just tell it to us very quickly. We don't have long.
Yeah, so it's an extraordinary story. So in Greece, basically, there's a big tradition of like reading the future via coffee. We drink Greek coffee. It's Turkish coffee. We call it Greek coffee there. And with the patterns that the coffee makes in the cup, people are able to tell the future. It's a form of astrology, if you might. A lot of people do it.
And it's how they like end up, what the grain's shapes make?
What the shapes are made in the cup. And according to those shapes, they can tell, you can have a great future here or there's an opportunity here. My grandmother does it to me all the time. A lot of people do it. Not everyone believes it, but some people take it really, really seriously. And now ChatGPT, the AI, apparently has a new prompt in which you can give it a picture and it can tell you the coffee for fun. Now, it's an extraordinary story in Greece because there is a case of a woman who has filed for divorce after she did this, and ChatGPT told her that her husband of like 12 years was unfaithful to her. So Greeks are gripped with this. It's a bit of a tabloid kids story, but at the same time, I think it's very interesting because it's an intersection of spirituality and science fiction at the same time.
It's the most brilliant story. I mean, no wonder it's making headlines.
It's so much fun.
So what, the ChatGPT or whatever it was read her coffee and
It did. It just read her the coffee and it just said that your husband is having a relationship with someone whose name starts with an E. And although they've been together for 12 years and they have 2 kids together, she has filed for a divorce. And the story has developed and has made a big media impact because the husband now appears in Greek talk shows to talk about his wife.
But is he having an affair with a woman whose name begins with E?
He is not, according to him. But we're still the news story is like unraveling.
Manos, that's just fantastic. Thank you. And I'm going to ask you to read my coffee after this.
I will do this afterwards.
Emmanuel Papavassiliou, thank you very much indeed. And that's all we have time for. Thanks to our producers, Laura Kramer, Carlotta Rabella and Hassan Anderson, our researcher, Francesca Gilks, and our studio manager, Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and the briefing will be live at midday in London. And the Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.